Hey everyone, I'm Joe. Welcome back to Sip and Talk.
It's always great when we get a question from one of you that really makes us think, and today's is definitely one of those. It comes from someone studying abroad who's noticed something, well, something they found pretty striking. We're going to be diving into a really complex topic today, why there seems to be this, disconnect between how some people see Taiwan's status and how it often gets talked about internationally, especially maybe in schools or universities. It's got layers: history, politics, identity. It's a lot. We're going to try and unpack why these different views exist based on what we've gathered.
Yeah, and this listener's question, it really does hit on a super common point of confusion. I mean, especially when people from different backgrounds meet this stuff outside their home country. It's actually a fantastic way in, isn't it? To understanding bigger things like international relations, how history gets told, national narratives, even cultural identity. So our mission today really is to explore these different perspectives, look at the realities behind them, just based on the information we've looked into, to help understand why it can feel so jarring when these different understandings bump up against each other.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Starting right with the listener's own experience. Like we said, this comes from a Chinese student studying overseas. And they've noticed in different schools, different countries even, a pattern keeps popping up. Teachers, professors, even their classmates from Taiwan. They often just refer to Taiwan as, well, a country. And the listener's reaction, based on what they shared, they felt this was just plain wrong. The term they used was pretty strong: cognitive error, or in Chinese, yeah, and they felt this real sense of duty, almost like they had to step in and correct people. You get a sense of real frustration there, like how can everyone be getting this basic fact wrong?
And that reaction, well, maybe it sounds intense to someone else. It makes complete sense when you understand the context. Where that listener is coming from, educationally and culturally, it stems directly, like really deeply, from the education system in mainland China. From day one, pretty much, the message is consistent, it's unequivocal. Taiwan is an inseparable part of China, and it's not presented as, here's one political view. It's taught as fundamental truth. It's core to the national story, the idea of territorial integrity. It's in the textbooks, the history lessons, state media, everything. So imagine you've grown up with that. Yeah. Just that one single, constantly reinforced narrative: Taiwan is part of China. End of story. Then you go abroad, and suddenly
everyone's saying something different.
Exactly. It's more than just hearing a different opinion. It's a real culture shock. It causes this deep cognitive dissonance, right? Because the views you're hearing, maybe views that talk about Taiwan's democracy or its autonomy, they clash head-on with what you've been taught, is absolute fact. It really just highlights how much our backgrounds, our education, shape how we see the world, especially when it comes to politics and history.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting, because that raises the big question: why? Why do so many people outside of mainland China seem to hold this view? Why is it so common to hear Taiwan talked about as if it's a separate country, or at least, its own thing? Let's look at the reasons that seem to pop up from the information we've looked at.
Well, a huge part of it seems to be that observers internationally, academics, policymakers, journalists, people outside that specific mainland Chinese context, they tend to look at the situation on the ground, the reality, rather than just, say, accepting political claims at face value. And when they look at Taiwan, what they see is often described using this political science term: de facto statehood. De facto statehood into insistent yi, shi shong it is quan shikne, basically means it acts like a sovereign entity in reality, even if his formal legal status isn't universally recognized.
De facto, so in fact, even if not in law, everywhere.
Precisely. Look at the practical stuff, the details we have really lay this out. Taiwan functions like an independent state in almost every way. It has its own government, right? Yeah. Democratically elected president, legislature, the legislative yuan, its own court system, executive branch running things day to day. It has its own distinct military, the Republic of China Armed Forces. Completely separate system from the PLA on the mainland. It issues its own money, the new Taiwan dollar. Decides who comes in, who goes out, got its own legal system, tax system, builds its own infrastructure. And importantly, it has its own ways of dealing with other countries, even if a lot of that is, well, informal. And, if you think about the classic checklist for what makes a state, like the Montevideo Convention from way back in 1933.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. Population, territory.
Right. Permanent population, defined territory, government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. Well, Taiwan, in practice, ticks a lot of those boxes. maybe all of them, depending on how you interpret capacity to enter relations. So international observers, especially the ones focused on like practical geopolitics or international law, they see this functioning reality. That's often what informs how they describe Taiwan's status. Like having a passport that gets you into over 100 countries visa-free, that's a pretty tangible sign of functioning independently.
Right. And that functional reality, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. There's crucial history behind it. The information we have really underscores that moment in 1949. That's when the Chinese Civil War basically ended on the mainland. The Kuomintang, the KMT government, lost to the communists, the CCP, and retreated to Taiwan. And the CCP established the People's Republic of China, the PRC, on the mainland.
And this historical point, it's something where historians outside mainland China pretty much all agree. The Chinese Communist Party has never actually ruled Taiwan, not for one day since 1949.
Never. That's a key point.
It is. Since then, Taiwan has been governed separately. First by the Republic of China government under martial law. Yeah, authoritarian back then. But then it went through this whole democratic transition, peaceful, successful transition into the multi-party democracy it is today. So this long history, like over 70 years of separate governance, never ruled by Beijing. That's a fundamental reality that international observers just can't ignore when they talk about Taiwan. It makes it really hard to just equate Taiwan with the PRC based on historical claims alone.
And if you look at Taiwan today, how it operates internationally, it just reinforces that idea of it being distinct. You've got regular, free, fair elections, often with huge voter turnout.
Very high turnout, yeah.
A media landscape that's, well, pretty robust and mostly independent. You see public opinion polls all the time showing what people there actually think about their identity, their future.
And they participate internationally too, right? Like the Olympics. They compete, but under that special name, Chinese Taipei.
Right, that compromise name.
Yeah, it's a compromise. It lets the athletes compete without forcing everyone to formally settle the political fight right then and there.
Yeah.
But still, they're participating on the world stage.
Yeah.
These are all things you associate with independent entities, you know.
Okay, but how does this square with, like, official diplomacy? Because most countries do recognize Beijing, right?
Ah, yes. That's where it gets really, really nuanced. You're right. Most countries, including big ones like the U.S., they officially recognize the PRC government in Beijing as the sole legal government of China. They operate under what's generally called a one China policy. Now, this policy usually involves acknowledging Beijing's claim that Taiwan is part of China, but, and this is the absolute crucial bit that often gets missed, this diplomatic policy is very often different from Beijing's one China principle, the Yuzhongguanzhe.
Okay, policy versus principle. What's the difference?
The Gates principle is non-negotiable for them, it says. There's only one China, it's the PRC, and Taiwan is an inseparable part of the PRC, full stop. You have to accept this principle to have formal diplomatic ties with Beijing. But many countries' policy uses careful wording. They might say they acknowledge Beijing's position or they note it. They often deliberately avoid language like endorse or recognize sovereignty over Taiwan.
Ah, so it's like diplomatic wiggle room.
Exactly. It creates space. It lets these countries manage their vital relationship with Beijing while also maintaining really strong, substantial, but technically unofficial relations with Taiwan. Think about the American Institute in Taiwan, the AIT. It functions just like an embassy in almost every practical way, issues visas, helps businesses, cultural stuff, high-level communication happens. But it's not formally called an embassy. It's this highly developed, non-official diplomacy. A complex workaround, really, to deal with the political sensitivities while still engaging with Taiwan as this important democratic and economic partner.
Right, okay. And let's swing back to the classroom setting where the listener first noticed this. There's the academic freedom angle too, isn't there?
Definitely. In a lot of democratic countries, universities value academic freedom pretty highly. Educators are generally expected to explore different perspectives, look at the facts, analyze things based on disciplines like history or political science. They aren't usually required to stick to the political scripts of any one government.
So they wouldn't necessarily be bound by Beijing's narrative?
Generally, no. The information we looked at suggests that academics in these places tend to analyze somewhere like Taiwan based on how it actually is governed, its democratic processes, its economy, its unique history, how it interacts with the world.
Like that Harvard example mentioned, treating Taiwan as its own research unit.
Exactly. That's not necessarily Harvard making a political statement about independence. It's more likely reflecting the academic reality that Taiwan has totally different political, economic, social systems than mainland China. Different history since '49, different government. So if you want to study those systems accurately, you kind of have to look at them separately. So yeah, the academic approach and often the wider international view, it tends to focus on what is, what functions, what's the history of actual rule, how do the people there see themselves. It's less about just repeating historical sovereignty claims from one side or the other. And that kind of independent analysis naturally leads people to describe Taiwan in ways that reflect its functional independence, which is exactly what surprised our listener.
Okay, so given all that, the de facto reality, the history, the international policies, academic freedom, it makes the listener's next question even more pointed. They wondered if this common international view, seeing Taiwan as basically independent, is because Taiwan's ruling party, the DPP, has somehow washed the world's brain, the snake and owl idea. What does the information say about that?
Great, the brainwashing theory.
Yeah.
Well, this is where looking at resources and the influence really matters. The information we have draws a pretty stark contrast. It compares Taiwan's stated foreign affairs budget. We're talking maybe tens of billions of new Taiwan dollars a year.
Which sounds like a lot, but
then you compare it to the estimated spending by China on its external propaganda, its United Front work, aimed at influencing foreign audiences. The estimates there are often in the hundreds of billions of renminbi. It's just a completely different league, a vastly different scale of resources being thrown at, shaping how the world sees things.
So Taiwan's budget is mostly for regular diplomacy. Embassies, they still have representative offices, trade promotion.
Yeah, standard stuff, running their overseas presence, cultural exchanges, maybe some foreign aid, typical government spending. China's budget, though, which could be, 10, 20 times bigger, it funds this huge systematic effort across many fronts, specifically designed to push Beijing's narrative, including on Taiwan.
And what about the media? The listener mentioned world media being influenced.
Well, think about the big international news outlets, CNN, BBC, New York Times, Reuters, places like that. Generally speaking, they value their editorial independence. They can be quite critical of government control over information, especially from places known for censorship.
So the idea that a party from Taiwan could just control their narrative...
It seems pretty unlikely. Taiwan just doesn't have that kind of global clout or the financial leverage over these huge media corporations or the political power to dictate what they report on a global scale. Their reporting on Taiwan usually comes from, having reporters there talking to different people, analyzing what's happening politically and socially within Taiwan.
Plus, there's the timing, isn't there? This view of Taiwan being functionally independent isn't brand new.
Exactly. The information points this out clearly. This international perception, or at least strong international support for Taiwan's distinct status and participation, predates the DPP being in power comprehensively since 2016. Support from places like the US, Japan, the EU for Taiwan joining international groups, engaging with this democracy that was happening decades before under different governments in Taiwan. So that suggests the view is rooted in something deeper, more long-standing than just the current ruling party's efforts or supposed propaganda.
So if it's not Taiwan washing brains, what is shaping the global view, according to the information?
Well, the information really pivots the perspective here. If you're looking for who's engaged in massive, systematic efforts to shape global opinion and control narratives about China and Taiwan, the evidence overwhelmingly points towards Beijing. It's often called China's great external propaganda strategy, or Jiexia Daoisuan, and it's this huge, coordinated, multi-pronged campaign.
What does that involve?
All sorts of things. Using state media like CGTN or Global Times to push Beijing's line internationally. Setting up Confucius Institutes around the world, which promote a specific version of Chinese culture and history, including where Taiwan fits in. Investing in or influencing global social media apps, think doing TikTok, WeChat. Even buying stakes in foreign news outlets or partnering with them to get favorable coverage.
And direct pressure, too.
Oh, definitely. The information gives clear examples. Constant diplomatic pressure to block Taiwan from joining international bodies like the World Health Organization or the Aviation Agency, ICAO. Pressuring big companies, airlines, even artists not to list Taiwan separately or risk losing access to the huge Chinese market. Using big economic deals or political muscle to get countries to switch diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing. These aren't subtle things. They're very visible, systematic campaigns happening all over the world aimed squarely at controlling the story about Taiwan and shrinking its international space.
Okay, so wrapping up this point then. The idea that the international view stems from DPP brainwashing doesn't seem to hold up against the scale of resources or the historical timeline.
That seems to be the conclusion presented. The international perception looks less like the result of Taiwanese propaganda, and more like a judgment call by various countries and observers based on Taiwan's actual observable reality, its democracy, its separate systems, its history, apart from PRC rule, all happening while Beijing is engaged in these very extensive global efforts to push its own narrative and isolate Taiwan.
Right. Let's shift gears a bit then and look at the cultural side, identity, because that's huge in this story, especially within Taiwan itself. The information highlights a really major trend there.
Yeah, absolutely massive. Over the last few decades, there's been this profound shift in how people in Taiwan see themselves. It's well documented. More and more people, especially younger generations, identify as primarily Taiwanese, not Chinese in the sense of identifying with mainland China.
You mentioned poll data.
Yes. Things like the long-running surveys from Tsinghua University consistently show this. You look at, say, the 20 to 39 age group, the figures mentioned suggest over 80% identify purely as a Taiwanese, not Chinese, not even both Taiwanese and Chinese, just Taiwanese.
Oh, over 80% in that age group.
It's a huge majority among younger people. And it comes from lots of things. Taiwan becoming a democracy in the late 80s, early 90s, which created this sense of a separate political path. The fact that they haven't shared the same daily life experiences as people on the mainland since 1949, developing their own unique culture, mixing different influences, and reacting to the political pressure from across the strait. This strong sense of a distinct Taiwanese identity is absolutely central to how people there view their own status and how they present themselves to the world. When they say Taiwan is Taiwan, it's often coming straight from that feeling of being a distinct nation, a distinct people.
Okay, let's bring it back to the listener, the Chinese student we started with. Their strong reaction, feeling angry, needing to correct people. We said it's understandable given their background, right? Where Taiwan as part of China is taught as this core, unshakable truth.
Exactly. And that belief is often tied up with really strong feelings of national pride, a specific understanding of history learned in school, and this sense of duty towards national unity, keeping the territory intact.
It makes that analogy used in the information really hit home.
The Earth Center versus Sun Center one.
Yeah. Like being taught your whole life with absolute certainty that the Earth is the center of everything. Then you go somewhere new and everyone, teachers, friends, just casually talks about the sun being the center like it's obvious.
It's not just a small disagreement. It shakes your foundations, right? It challenges something you thought was bedrock reality. So it's natural that might cause confusion, resistance, maybe even anger. Because it feels like an attack on your whole understanding of how things are, and maybe even your identity that's connected to that understanding.
And there's another layer, too, in those university settings especially, a potential clash of values.
Right. The information touches on this. On many international campuses, particularly in democracies, there's a really strong emphasis on freedom of speech, academic freedom. The idea is that different viewpoints, even controversial ones, should be discussed, debated, researched openly.
Which might feel very different depending on where you come from.
Absolutely. If you come from an education system or a society where politically sensitive topics aren't openly debated, or where there's one dominant national narrative that isn't supposed to be challenged, then encountering an environment where people do openly express different views on Taiwan, where they might casually call it a country based on its functional reality, that can be a real shock to the system. That freedom to voice opinions that directly contradict what you were taught as absolute fact can feel deeply uncomfortable, maybe even threatening. It can feel like an attack on your beliefs or your national identity. And sometimes that discomfort comes out as anger or defensiveness instead of, say, curiosity about why those other views exist.
Okay, this is super complex. Let's maybe drill down a bit more into some of the finer points the information brings up. Policies, principles, the future.
Yeah, definitely. That distinction we touched on earlier, the one China principle versus the one China policy, it's worth hammering that home because it causes so much confusion internationally.
So Beijing's principle is the hard line.
Exactly. Rigid, non-negotiable. One China, TRC, Taiwan is part of it. You must accept this for formal relations.
Yeah, the policy used by the U.S. and others is more flexible.
It's a diplomatic construct. Carefully worded ambiguity, you could say. It lets countries deal with Beijing while not necessarily signing off on Beijing's sovereignty claim over Taiwan. They acknowledge or note Beijing's position, but they don't usually endorse it. It's this delicate balancing act, this strategic ambiguity that allows them to keep channels open with both sides.
So how does Taiwan itself handle being in the middle of all this? The information mentioned a trend.
Yeah, the trend is pretty clear. While the official government name is still Republic of China, which carries historical baggage from when it claimed to rule all of China, The reality, especially under recent DPP governments, is a steady move away from emphasizing that historical one China framework. They increasingly stress Taiwan's distinctness. You hear Taiwan as Taiwan a lot more in official language, in foreign policy, and it definitely resonates with public opinion. It's about blurring those old lines or stepping away from them.
And that public opinion seems really solid on this.
Extremely solid, based on the data mentioned, like from the Chengxi University polls that have tracked this stuff for ages. Support for unifying with the mainland. Consistently tiny, like under 10% for years. Support for keeping the status quo, basically, staying as they are. Self-governing, but not formally declaring independence. That's usually well over 60%.
And the identity part we talked about.
Right, the dominant Taiwanese identity, especially among the young. That public feeling is a powerful driver. In a democracy like Taiwan, the government has to listen to that. And the clear message from the public is, we want to maintain our de facto independence and our distinct identity.
Which leads right into that really thorny internal debate in Taiwan. What to do about the official name, Republic of China, ROC.
Oh yeah, that's a huge one. Super complex, with really strong feelings on all sides. The information lays out the arguments pretty well.
So what's the argument for changing the name? Maybe to Republic of Taiwan or just Taiwan?
The main arguments are, it would finally ditch the confusing historical baggage. It would better match how most people there actually feel their Taiwanese identity. It would create a clearer distinction from the PRC internationally, because Beijing sometimes uses the ROC history to back its own claims over Taiwan. And maybe it would just be better branding, Taiwan can help makes more sense than explaining the whole ROC-PRC thing. Some see it as the logical next step in cementing Taiwan's separate nationhood.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But there must be big reasons not to do it, or why it hasn't happened.
Huge reasons. The number one reason is Beijing. Changing the name, changing the constitution, declaring a Republic of Taiwan that's seen by Beijing as legal independence, and they've repeatedly said that's a red line that could trigger war. That's the biggest deterrent, obviously.
Military threat.
Absolutely. Then there's the international fallout. Remember that strategic ambiguity. If Taiwan formally changes its name, it could force all those countries with one China policies to finally choose. Do they stick with Beijing or recognize the new Taiwan? Many worry that most countries would choose Beijing, leading to even more diplomatic isolation for Taiwan, losing those crucial unofficial ties.
And internal divisions, too.
Yes. While Taiwanese identity is dominant, there are still people in Taiwan, maybe older generations, or those with historical links to the mainland, who identify with the ROC framework. A name change would be deeply divisive internally. Plus, the entire current legal system is based on the ROC Constitution. Changing it would be a massive legal and political undertaking.
So it's not something they'd do lightly?
Not at all. The conclusion seems to be that a formal name change is incredibly high stakes. It would need like a perfect storm of conditions. Overwhelming consensus inside Taiwan, way more than just 50%, maybe 70% or more wanting it. Really strong, guaranteed support from major international powers like the U.S. And a calculation that Taiwan could actually withstand the almost certain backlash from Beijing militarily and economically. It's a move with potentially existential risks.
Wow. Okay, so pulling all these threads together, we started with a listener noticing teachers called Taiwan a country, feeling it was wrong and wondering about brainwashing. And we've gone through history, de facto reality, international policy nuances, identity shifts, internal debates. What's the big takeaway here?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that the international view, seeing Taiwan as functionally independent, even if the formal status is disputed, it isn't just some random mistake or, like the listener feared, the result of propaganda from one party. Based on everything we've discussed, this view seems grounded in observing Taiwan's reality. Its democratic government, its separate systems, its history apart from the PRC since 1949, and increasingly, how the people of Taiwan see themselves.
So it's based on observation, mostly?
Largely, yeah. Observation of facts on the ground, analyzed through different frameworks, political science, international relations, history, often outside the specific narrative promoted by Beijing. And going back to the listener's initial reaction, it really highlights this clash of narratives, doesn't it? One narrative, deeply ingrained through education in mainland China, focuses on historical claims, national unity, and sees any deviation as fundamentally wrong. The other narrative, common internationally, looks more at present-day reality, democratic self-governance, self-determination, and the practical functioning of states.
So for you, our listener, maybe the key isn't about deciding who's right or wrong in some absolute sense.
Perhaps not. Maybe it's more about understanding why these different perspectives exist, understanding the historical context, the political realities, the power of education and national narratives, the nuances of diplomacy. It helps you navigate these incredibly complex global issues.
It's like seeing the different lenses people are using to view the same situation.
Exactly. And recognizing that someone else's lens, shaped by a totally different background and set of information, might lead them to a genuinely different conclusion. It's an opportunity, really, to learn about how the world works beyond just formal pronouncements, how identity, history, and real-world function all play a part.
Which leaves us with a pretty big question to chew on, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. Given how powerful these national narratives and educational backgrounds are, and how sensitive issues like Taiwan status obviously are, how do people from such different starting points actually talk about these things? How can we have conversations that build understanding, maybe find common ground instead of just hitting walls or getting angry? How do we as individuals or even nations try to reconcile claims rooted in history with the realities of the present day, especially when people's identities and futures are so deeply tied to the outcome? It's a huge challenge in our world today.
It really is a lot to think about there. And that brings us to the end of this deep dive. What started as one listener's really sharp observation took us into some incredibly deep waters: history, politics, identity. It shows just how layered these global situations can be.
Absolutely. And thanks again to the listener for sending in the question that got us started on this. It was a really worthwhile exploration.
Definitely. We always appreciate the questions and insights you share. They fuel these conversations. Well, folks, that's all the deep diving we have time for today. Hope you found that useful.
Yeah, definitely a complex picture.
If you did find it interesting, please make sure you hit that subscribe button for the Sip and Talk podcast. Keep up with our dives.
We appreciate you tuning in.
And hey, while you're at it, why not pop over and check out our good buddy Mickey's YouTube channel? Give him some love. You know you want to.
Always good stuff over there.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive. See you then.